let's start with, I guess, a fairly obvious question. When Keir Starmer hosted the leaders of 15 countries on the 2nd of March to talk about security guarantees for Kyiv, there were some notable omissions: Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. How was that received?
Very, very poorly. They feel that they have the most at stake, being the most militarily exposed members of NATO and being some of Britain's closest allies. And they very much felt that they ought to have been in the room, even if there was this kind of deputization system with Denmark.
And they have sort of good historical reasons for being narked. Your book contains lots of fascinating history, but if we go back to the interwar period, if we go back to the immediate Soviet period, there were lots of times when that part of the world looked to Britain and her allies for support and really didn't get it.
Well, Britain, as the dominant naval power in the world, and especially in Northern Europe and the Baltic, was absolutely instrumental in the region's security going back before the Second World War, and played a very important role in helping the 3 Baltic republics to secure their independence from Russia for the first time after the First World War with naval support. And today that is reflected in a kind of sub-NATO alliance called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which Britain oversees with the Baltic states, the 5 Nordic states and the Netherlands. And that is, in theory, the kind of first line of defence for the Baltic states. It's very important to them.
I know that in Finland, memory of that very heroic Winter War and Mannerheim's defence and all the rest of it remains completely part of the national memory, the national attitude, as it were, towards Russia. Is it more or less the same in a different context for the Baltic states?
It's different because Finland has this equivalent to the Battle of Britain as not just a sort of period of heroic resistance, but also a period where its national identity finally cohered after a very brutal civil war in 1920 that left extremely deep divisions in society, whereas it is still a matter of shame to the Baltic states this day that not a single shot was fired when they were annexed by the Soviet Union.
And indeed, they were pretty close to Nazi Germany for a while. There were Einsatzgruppen working right across the Baltic states, and there was quite a lot of collaboration. That is not just Russian propaganda, is it?
It's not just Russian propaganda, and it is also not quite a nettle that the Baltic states have really grasped yet in the way that, for example, Germany has. And the reality is that, yes, there was a lot of voluntary collaboration. Some of the very highest per capita death rates anywhere in Europe during the Holocaust. Vilnius, which had previously been known as the Jerusalem of the North, centre of tremendous rabbinical scholarship going back centuries, the Jewish population was effectively completely wiped out. And that was not just with active collaboration from individuals from the Baltic republics. In the case of Lithuania, the government was proactively pumping out anti-Semitic propaganda before the Germans even arrived.
Wow. And coming nearer to our current times, of course, there are pretty large Russian-speaking minorities there. And as with Ukraine, that is what really seems to kind of excite Putin's aggressive instincts.
Well, this is a very interesting one. I've taken a slightly contrarian view in the course of the book, reporting from Latvia, where by 1989, the final census of the Soviet Union, 48% of the population were native Russian speakers, mostly Russians, but also Ukrainians and Belarusians. So they were right on the brink of becoming a minority within their own territory. And that figure has gone down a bit. It's something like 32, 34% today, but it's still a source of great tension and conflict in Latvian society.
And is there any sense that that very big minority wants to go back to Russia, or wants the Russians to come in?
Well, this is my contrarian position. I think absolutely not.
Really?
I think the idea that these are fifth columnists in waiting, sort of poised to stage an uprising and invite the tanks to roll in, has got it exactly backwards. That they are so politically fragmented and vociferous, and yes, large numbers of them are very alienated from Latvian society, but there is, as far as I could tell, extremely little appetite for becoming part of Russia. I mean, would they rather be paid in rubles or euros?
They're Russians who don't want to live under Putin.
Exactly.
I can dimly remember when it all happened, but even when the Baltic states broke away from the Soviet Union, there was a kind of weary surprise in the West that such tiny little entities could have any future at all outside the Soviet
I mean, weary
empire.
surprise is putting it very generously. There was horror because the great Western powers, Britain included, had bet very heavily on Gorbachev And they worried that these national separatist movements in these tiny countries would, or not even, there were Soviet republics at that point, would destabilize Gorbachev and weaken his hand against the hardliners in his own administration. And so when Lithuania declared its independence at the start of 1990 and became subject to a full-blown Soviet economic blockade, the West Germans in particular were so worried about jeopardizing reunification that they put tremendous diplomatic pressure on the Lithuanians to back down. And in the end, it wasn't any of the great Western powers that recognized Lithuania's independence in 1991 when it finally got there. It was Iceland.
I talk all the time to, politicians, MPs, political spads and so on, who go over to Poland, go to the Baltics, go to Finland, trying to kind of sense the current mood. I'm sure you know the current mood much better than any of them do. So do they really fear some kind of imminent Russian attack?
Fear is an interesting word, because if you talk to the Estonians, they'll tell you they've been invaded by Russia at least 40 times in the last 800 years. And psychologically, or in terms of political psychology, it's very difficult to sustain fear for that long, especially over the past 35 years. So it's more like the people who live on the lower slopes of active volcanoes, and they know it goes off every 30 or 40 years.
And they're tough people and they're inured to it. Alexander Stubb of Finland has become a kind of Western pin-up or Western hero, partly because of his famous golf game with Donald Trump, but also because he again sort of radiates a kind of calm, steely determination. He says we've got a very, very large army in terms of reservists. We're prepared. We've done it before. We can do it again. In other words, it's not like any other part of Western Europe that I can think of contemplating the possibility of fighting Russia.
It is a very effective style of political communication that I think leaders elsewhere in Europe would benefit from studying, but it is also predicated on a very deeply ingrained understanding in the Finnish population, going back to the Winter War, which you mentioned earlier in 1939 to 1940, of how serious the stakes are and how much grand strategy the Finns have put in over the past 75 years into gearing up for this scenario and really structuring everything, including the corporate sector, to preserve their independence in a crisis.
So we've talked a lot about the sort of scary security aspects of all of this, but in the book you argue that the Baltic states are a kind of better version of Europe that the rest of us could learn from. Just explain a little bit about that.
If this doesn't sound too abstract, I think the real foundation here is how they look at time. This is a part of the world where the end of history never happened and which was geopolitically completely shattered at the dawn of the 1990s and has cohered in what I think is the single strongest example of successful European integration in my lifetime. It wired together what used to be the Eastern Bloc and the West more deeply than probably any other region on the planet. And so they don't have a sense of being on the defensive and of trying to preserve something that is slipping out of their hands. They have a sense that these are just changes
they're
as
making
they've known
a new
them so many
future
times.
right now.
Exactly. There's a sense of futurity. And that makes so many things possible, including a social contract that is quite different to what we have in Britain, which is really founded on the idea that the central and overriding duty of the state is to provide security to its citizens.
Which may be eventually where we are heading back to here as well. But of course, they've also got very, very modernized, digitalized, they're at the lead of using AI to modernize government, and they have a different way of running their social services that, again, I think we could probably learn from.
Absolutely. So the sort of star pupil here is Estonia, where in the early 1990s, they had very little kind of competitive industry because the Soviet factories had been so inefficiently run, and they thought strategically, what is the best route to prosperity? How do we use our resources, which is basically just our human capital? And they identified the early internet as the way to do that. And it's been tremendously successful. They are probably the most digitally advanced country in Europe. The ways that they are using AI are light years ahead of Germany and Britain.
Well, there is a little bright area of optimism. Let's return to the sort of military and strategic aspect of this, which is really why we're talking, I guess. Now, Germany's armed forces, still very, very unprepared, are nonetheless central in any attempt to defend this part of the world, the Baltic states. And I'd like to ask you, you're based in Berlin, of course, what your view is about, the attitude, the determination for German rearmament, because Carsten Breuer, who's Inspector General of the Bundeswehr, has argued that NATO should be braced for a possible attack in as little as 4 years' time.
That's correct. And if you believe the Danish intelligence service, it could be as little as 6 months, according to their latest estimate. And just a very brief bit of context. After the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, 3 days later, the now outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood up in the Bundestag and announced what he called a Zeitenwende, a turning point in German history, of which the centerpieces were a 100 billion euro rearmament fund and a commitment to finally meet NATO's 2% of GDP on defence spending target. And in fairness to Scholz, he has done both of those things. The state of equipment and morale in the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, has improved quite significantly, but it is nowhere like where it needs to be if it's going to honour its commitments. And so as a result, the probable incoming Chancellor, the Christian Democrat leader Friedrich Merz, has pulled off a very sort of adventurous parliamentary manoeuvre to put through a package that is an order of magnitude bigger than the Zeitenwende. This is the real Zeitenwende. You have 500 billion of infrastructure spending, including on bits of infrastructure that you need to move tanks and personnel to the Baltic states in a crisis. But more significantly, you have theoretically unlimited defence spending. But I do have some reservations about the papers that are coming out of the coalition talks now. They're struggling to agree on whether to even set a defence spending target, and they're really divided over whether to try and gradually reintroduce conscription. So the jury's very much out on what kind of defence policy we're going to get.
And does Germany have a military-industrial base sufficient to do what they need to do?
Well, the fascinating thing is Germany has some very good defence manufacturers, and it also has some very good emerging defence tech companies like Helsing, the AI and drone
Helsing's
maker,
the famous one,
the
isn't it?
rising
Yeah.
star of European defence. But the defence sector in Germany is a tiny proportion of their manufacturing base. And so this idea that you can flood the sector with stimulus and that this is somehow going to lift the entire German economy is a bit fanciful. But what we are seeing now, fascinatingly, is that the decline of the car-making industry and above all of the car parts manufacturers allows the defence manufacturers to move in. They will take over these car part factories.
I was going to ask about that. That's fascinating, yeah.
And they can be repurposed in the space of months, which is very uncharacteristically agile for Germany.
Absolutely. So Volkswagen and so on go back to making tanks and guns and so on. Let's pretend we're military planners and talk about the Suvalki Gap.
Suvalki Gap is a stretch of about 55 miles of the Lithuanian-Polish frontier that is between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic coast and Belarus, which is effectively a military outpost of Russia now, where they're about to conduct very large-scale joint manoeuvres in the Zapad exercise with Russia. And the biggest headache for NATO war planners has always been, if you wanted to cut off the Baltic states, all you would have to do was a single thrust. Along this line, you could do it in the space of a day, theoretically, and you would completely choke off the land route for reinforcements. That said, if you look at the geography of it, it's a nightmare for the attacking side. And NATO planners have been so aware of this problem that they have drawn up pretty good contingency things. So I think it would be more contested in reality than we've tended to fear.
And, of course, Poland herself is the kind of poster girl of rearmament for the West.
Absolutely. The largest conventional armed forces in mainland Europe, more tanks than Britain, Germany, Italy and France put together, gigantic acquisitions of rocket launch systems, jets, howitzers from Korea. They're on course to spend 5% of their GDP on defence next year. 3
times over the past year and a half, commercial ships are suspected of having damaged critical undersea communications and a gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea. And I was talking to a Scottish MP thinking about the pipelines coming into Scotland, and he said, in the Baltics, Andrew, they are not trying to spook us, they are rehearsing.
Yeah, so there's a line of argument that says, well, what if these were genuinely accidents? And the head of the German Navy said, these anchors are ginormous, and if a ship drops one by mistake, it makes a noise like a tank going through a cobbled square, and you would absolutely know and stop the ship. So the idea that 6 commercial ships from Russia's shadow fleet or China's fleet have sort of accidentally let these things slip and then hauled them over electricity cables, gas pipelines, data cables, is very kind of a priori implausible. And this is a part of... Actually, Russia experts don't like the term hybrid war because we invented it. They prefer to regard it as a strategy of sort of industrial grade sub-military warfare. And every single non-military tool you can think of has been deployed. There has been an assassination plot on the chief executive of Rheinmetall, the largest German defense manufacturer. There have been daily drone incursions on German military bases. There have been hundreds of cases of sabotage of European railways. There have been complete bombardment of over social media with disinformation. There's been political subversion, the suborning and bribery of politicians. I could keep listing these for another 5 minutes.
So we in Britain, we remember Litvinenko and we remember the Salisbury poisoning and we think it's us, but actually we are only a small part of a much bigger picture.
That's right. And the really interesting question is what the Russians are trying to achieve. And there is a division of expert opinion. Some will tell you that the idea is fundamentally to keep us unstable, to keep our polities divided, to make decision-making more difficult. But there is a darker interpretation of this, which is that if you put a lot of it together, it looks like laying the ground for a military invasion. The reconnaissance and the sabotage of civilian infrastructure that could be turned to military purposes. People like Keir Giles, the brilliant Russia analyst at Chatham House, very much see this as a systematic preparation for a possible NATO-Russia war.
And I think about 97% of British internet traffic comes through cables, not through satellites.
That's true. That's as a whole. Yeah.
All our banking, all the systems which deliver food to our shops, everything that we depend upon is in these cables, really. And they're very, very vulnerable.
That's absolutely true. But one note of optimism is that people have been aware of this, of course. And the way that you minimize the impact of that is just to have lots of cables. So as a result, we are building far more redundancy. And these half a dozen incidents you alluded to over the past 12 months have really caused no lasting disruption because you can just switch to an alternative route. So we do have a bit more resilience than we like to think. That's
a little bit of optimism there. Let's talk about the American involvement in Europe. Very, very of the moment, of course. After Moscow launched the attack on Ukraine in 2022, the Americans dispatched an additional 20,000 troops to reinforce the eastern border, bringing the total number here to over 100,000. Is there worry growing in Germany and elsewhere that Trump might now withdraw these troops? Is there any sign of it?
There is a great deal of worry, not just in Germany, but in Poland and the Baltic states above all. Because they are so utterly dependent on not just the presence of American troops, but also the credibility of the American nuclear deterrent. And frankly, there's been a lot of I told you so since Trump came back to the White House from this end of Europe, saying, we've been telling you for the last 10 years you should have been spending more on your military when the Americans were asking nicely, and now you're being bullied into it and it's turning out to be tremendously expensive. I actually think that slightly misses the seriousness of the situation, because what additionally complicates it is this line we've heard from J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, where it seems very much as though he, at least, would very much like to refashion Europe politically in the image of MAGA.
He sees Europe as a decadent, decaying, failing zone, not even a country, not an empire, nothing else, but as a kind of failing and decadent zone that needs to be woken up, booted in the backside and given a really big shock.
Right. And the country that's been absolutely in the crossfires of that has been Germany. And Vance has subsequently explicitly linked America's security guarantees to Germany with its willingness to enact reforms domestically that would be to the taste of the Trump administration. That said, I have to frame this carefully because it hasn't quite come out yet, but it would not surprise me if there were a slight sea change in Washington over the coming weeks and we were to see slightly more reassuring language or measures.
Well, that might not be unconnected to President Putin's rather poor mishandling of Donald Trump and the overreaching in terms of we want to get rid of the Kiev Nazi regime. We're not even going to talk about peace until Zelensky is out and all of that, which does seem to have deeply riled Trump, who in turn doesn't like being humiliated.
Well, and interestingly, you mentioned President Stubb's golfing trip to Mar-a-Lago, and it was after that, for the first time, that Trump gave a broadcast interview where he frankly criticised Putin and said he was, excuse my language, but I'm quoting, pissed off at his recalcitrance and unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. So I do wonder if this style of diplomacy has actually been the most effective thing to have come out of Europe towards the Trump administration yet.
Well, going back a little bit to what we were talking about before about Russia's real intentions, but opinion is a bit divided as to whether, in the end, Russia will attack the Baltics, would attack the Baltics. What's your own view?
I interviewed about 24 people who had been military attachés and other diplomats in Moscow and intelligence analysts and Russia scholars, and they're all over the place. And the more confident that they are in their prognostications about Putin's psychology, the less confident I am in them, frankly. And Putin himself once misquoted Bismarck to the effect that it is not intentions that matter, it's capabilities. And if there is one thing I think you can confidently say about Putin, it is that he's very opportunistic, he's very tactical rather than strategic, and he likes to see how things go and then to kind of adapt his policy accordingly. So you really have to start this analysis from the cold, hard facts of what Russia can do rather than what you think Putin might do.
But he certainly sees, because he said this more or less, a Russian empire with borders which are not where Russia's borders are today.
That's correct. But it's also clear that in his ideology as he has described it, Ukraine falls into a very different category in terms of his perception of its fundamental kinship with the Russian nation to the Baltic states, which were, frankly, a pain in the backside for the Soviets during the occupation years. And if they were to be occupied and integrated into Russia, they have such strongly developed national identities that there's a concern it could set off a chain reaction across the other bits of Russia that might turn separatist. So it could turn out to be a gigantic strategic error.